So as we begin, we're coming into a really very, very interesting, strange, surprising, a number of words could be used to describe chapter 9 of Joshua, because we are surprised by what's happened. And let's unpack this chapter as quick and as good and as positive we can. Hope you have it there open. If not, you can look it up later. If we remember, at Jericho, Rahab both feared and trusted the Lord. She feared him and she trusted in him. And that's why her and her family were saved when the walls of Jericho came down. Her house was a part of the walls, in the tower of the walls, and by putting the scarlet ribbon, she was saved. The whole of the occupancy of her home was saved. And they became a part of the promise of the nation. And as we learned, she's in the genealogies of Jesus. And that is incredible, isn't it? Now we come to the Gibeonites. And the Gibeonites, they only feared God. They probably, as we read through, didn't trust him. In a sense, what I mean, put their trust and their whole lives, their salvation in him. They feared him. And so we come to a very, very interesting and a very important. I suppose what I want to say today is that the scriptures call it a ruse, a deception. The Gibeonites deceive Joshua. Now, the Gibeonites were a group within the groups of the nations that were in the land of Canaan. And let's just see what happens. Firstly, there's this unholy alliance, this group of kings. Now, all the kings west of Jordan heard about these things. That's the stuff that had happened. The kings of the hill country and the western foothills along the entire coast of the Mediterranean Sea as far as Lebanon, the kings of the Hittites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. Say that with these teeth in, very hard. They came together to wage war against Joshua and Israel. We don't hear any more about that until later, but they formed this. They would be skirmishing against each other quite regularly, but they formed this unholy alliance to protect themselves, so to speak, against what was coming. So let's have a look at what happens with the Gibeonites. However, the people of Gibeon, now they're mentioned a few times in the Old Testament, and at each time they're either called Hivites or Amorites. So probably they were a hybrid nation. They were intermixed, intermarried, and they were probably... and Gibeon is just a little bit on from Jericho. So we see the children of Israel wanting to move past Jericho from their camp at Gilgal and move out into to claim more spaces. They had heard, the Gibeonites had heard what Joshua had done to Jericho and Ai and resorted to a ruse. I love that line. They resorted to a ruse. In other words, they were going to come and they were going to in some way deceive Joshua. They went as a delegation whose donkeys were loaded with worn-out sacks, old wineskins, cracked and mended. They put worn and patched sandals on their feet and wore old clothes. All the bread food supply was dry and mouldy. Don't forget, they weren't that far away from Joshua. Then they went to Joshua in the camp at Gilgal and said to him and the Israelites, "We have come from a distant country to make a treaty with us." The Israelites said to the Hivites, "But perhaps you live near us, so how can we make a treaty with you?" "We are your servants," they said to Joshua. But Joshua asked, "Who are you and where do you come from?" Who are you and where do you come from? They said, "We are your servants." So, you know, quite often that was a terminology that was used as someone coming to someone and just asking that individual to look well upon them. So they said, "We are your servants." But you see how this passage unravels. They answered, "Your servants have come from a very distant country because of the fame of the Lord your God. For we have heard the reports of him, all he did in Egypt, and all he had did for the two kings of the Amorites east of the Jordan, Sihon king of Heshbon and Og king of Bashan." Great names, Sihon and Og, who reigned in Ashtaroth. And our elders and all the living in our country said to us, "Take provisions for your journey and go and meet with them and say to them, 'We are your servants.' Again, look, make a treaty with us. This bread of ours was warm when we packed it at our home on a day we left to come to you. But now see how dry and mouldy it is. And these wineskins we have filled with new, but they are cracked, and and our clothes and sandals are warm out by the weary long journey." So they put together this presentation of looking ragged, looking as though they come from a number of miles away. If you've ever been on a long haul flight or ever travelled long distances, by the time you get there, you are feeling a bit ragged, your hair's all over the place, you're feeling a bit smelly and what have you. So they had faked this so that Joshua would be pleased. They were being deceived to the Israelites by the flattery. Not only deceived by what they were seeing, the Gibeonites were saying some things that were flattery about the Israelites and what they had heard about them, etc. Okay, the Israelites sampled their provisions but did not inquire of the Lord. Now this line is really, really important in this. Here we see the children of Israel, specifically Joshua and the elders, who eventually, as we will see in a moment, make an alliance, a treaty with the Gibeonites. But they had not inquired of the Lord. Really, really important. They made decisions. Then Joshua made a treaty of peace with them and let them live. And the leaders and the assemblies ratified it by an oath. 3 days after they had made a treaty, the Israelites heard that they were neighbours living near them. So it got back to them that these Gibeonites were liars. They only lived just up the road. They hadn't really travelled. They hadn't performed this ruse, this deception. So the Israelites set out on the 3rd day and came to their cities, Gibeon, Kephirah, Beeroth, and Kiriath Jearim. But the Israelites did not attack them because the leaders of the assembly had sworn an oath to them by the Lord, the God of Israel. So this oath was binding because even though they didn't inquire of God, it was binding because it was done in the name of God. Now there's lots of things spinning around in my head about this, and I'm sure with you, how does that work? But the whole assembly grumbled against the leaders. So the elders and the leaders and Joshua, they had formed this alliance, this treaty with the Gibeonites, but the people were not happy. But all the leaders answered, "We have given them their oath by the Lord, the God of Israel. We cannot touch them now. This is what we will do to them. We will not let them live, we will let them live, so that God's wrath will not fall on us for breaking the oath we swore to them." So they were going to make the Gibeonites live. And they were going to live. But we move on. They were saved to serve. Do you notice they did say, "We have come as your servants. We have come as your servants." And ultimately, they performed that ruse, that deception, but probably in the history of the nation of the Gibeonites, they rued the day they played the ruse. They rued the day they played the ruse. They continued, "Let them live, let them be woodcutters and water carriers in the service of the whole assembly." So the leader's promise to them was kept. Then Joshua summoned the Gibeonites and said, "Why did you deceive us by saying, We live a long way from you. Well, actually, you live very near to us. You are now under a curse. You will never be released from the service as woodcutters and water carriers in the house of God. So they were to serve the nation Israel, and they were to live, and they would be fed, and they would be looked after, and they would come under the banner of the Israelites. But they were in service. They answered Joshua, your servants were clearly told how the Lord your God had commanded his servant Moses to give the whole land and wipe us all out, the inhabitants, before you. So we feared. They feared, but they didn't trust. For our lives because of you. And that is why we did this. We are now in your hands. Do to us whatever seems good and right to you. So this was not a sense of slavery. This was an acknowledgement that their lives had been saved. They were in fear of God, though probably they did not trust in the God of Israel. However, they willingly put themselves as subservient to the Israelites. So Joshua saved them from the Israelites, and they did not kill them. That day he made the Gibeonites woodcutters and water carriers for the assembly to provide. That is what they are to this day. I'm going to read you something from Deuteronomy, because Deuteronomy is really, really interesting with this. And this is what it says. When you march up to attack a city, make its people an offer of peace. If they accept and open their gates, all the people in it shall be subject and forced to labour to work for you. If they refuse to make peace and they engage you in battle, lay siege to that city. The Gibeonites knew a bit of this stuff. If they refuse to make peace and engage in battle with you, lay siege to the city. When the Lord your God delivers it into your hands, put to the sword all the men. As for the women and livestock and everything else in the city, you are to make these plunders for yourself. And you may use the plunder the Lord the God gives you for your enemies. That's interesting, isn't it? He let them have the spoils of Ai, but not Jericho, because that was more of a ceremony that they were performing. This is how you are to treat all the cities that are at a distance. So the Gibeonites realized that if they were at a distance, if they said they lived a distance, this is what the Israelites had to do from you, and do not belong to the nations nearby. This is how you are to treat the cities. So they were following, they knew this bit of the law, which is really interesting, isn't it? And they were using these words and this whole thing from Deuteronomy in their aid, in this ruse, to get their freedom. So they were saved to serve. It's very, very interesting that later on in the story of the children of Israel, when Saul becomes king, he tries, if I remember correctly, I'm trying to remember this, it's a bit vague, but he tries to remove the Gibeonite nation. And actually, because of the promise that was made to them, he couldn't really do that. And Saul suffered because of it, because they went to David, and Saul suffered because he had tried to rid the nation of the Gibeonites. Okay, what can we learn from this? I think what we can learn from this story, and contemporize it for ourselves and bring it up to date, is we need to be careful about the promises that we make. Doesn't mean we shouldn't make promises, but we should be really careful, and especially as Christians, we should make promises. We should always seek the Lord. They didn't seek the Lord, though in the grace of God, the Lord honoured their vow, an oath to the Gibeonite. We must seek his will, because a little later we'll be saying, thy will be done in the Lord's Prayer. We must always endeavour to do what God wants us to do. Don't be driven fully by our emotions and our desires. Sometimes we enter into promises, sometimes we enter into relationships where we promise all sorts of things and we can't deliver them, and we are born, and we just have to be really careful, don't we, that we are driven by the Spirit of God and we make our promises correctly. Beware of flattery. It can influence and distract us. Sometimes people can use flattery to get what they want. And sometimes we can be deceived and cushioned by flattery. And so flattery says that you can get you anywhere, but sadly a lot of people have used flattery. So we just need to be focused on God as we move forward. And they made a bit of a mistake. But the difference with Rahab is that Rahab feared the Lord and trusted the Lord. The Gibeonites just feared, and they used the Deuteronomical law in their favour, though it's not mentioned directly here, but that's how they were able to make that oath. So it's very interesting, isn't it, that we look at these stories and we think, well, there's not really much there, it's a bit of an old-fashioned strange story, but actually there's some really good ethics in it. It's a good moral teaching about how we, and good godly teaching of how we behave.